Welcome back to our class on literary criticism and theory. Before we proceed further, I would like all of us to recapitulate what we mean by literary criticism, what do we mean by literary theory. As we have studied in our classes through our SLM, in our earlier online remedial class, literary criticism refers to the act of interpreting and studying literature. What does a literary critic do? Who is a literary critic? A literary critic is someone who attempts an interpretation or an understanding of literary texts. What is the task or function of a literary critic? The task of a literary critic is to explain what a literary text means in terms of its aesthetic as well as social, political, or cultural statements. What about literary theory? This is literary criticism and critics. What do we know or what have we learned about literary theory? Literary theory or literary theories are ideas that act as a lens through which we see, through which a critic can view and talk about literature, art, or even culture now. Cultural studies is an important area of study now. These different lenses, these different theories, allow a critic to consider any work of art, any work of literature, based on the assumptions of that particular school of theory. It could be Marxist theory, it could be feminist theory, it could be psychoanalytic theory. So these different theories or these different lenses allow the critics to focus on some particular aspect of a literary work, which according to the critic, based on the literary framework, is or are important. Now let us take one or two examples. Suppose a critic is working on Marxist theory. What would such a critic do? That critic would focus on how the plot, the characters in a text are shaped according to their economic situation. On the other hand, if a critic is dealing with the same text but from the basis of post-colonial theory, what that critic might do is to look at the characters and the plot or the theme from the background of colonial powers such as countries like UK, Britain, or France, which ruled over different countries as imperial powers. And this critic will see how such powers, the colonial powers, treated the characters from the colonized nations presented in this text or in the text. These colonized nations could be India, Africa, the countries like Nigeria, the West Indies, the Caribbean region, etc. I did not start screen share. Let me start sharing the screen. Okay, I suppose the first slide, the title slide, Literary Criticism and Theory, is visible on your screens. We will quickly look at the contents of your syllabus as we have already discussed earlier. You have the Introduction to Classical and Medieval Criticism, where we discuss in detail Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas. From there, we move to the Renaissance and Neoclassical Literary Criticism, where we talk about Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry, John Dryden's Essay on Dramatic Poesy is prescribed, Samuel Johnson's Preface to Shakespeare is prescribed. Then we talk about Joseph Edison and his idea of true wit and false wit. We also look at Mary Wollstonecraft's seminal essay, Vindication of the Rights of Women. We talk about William Wordsworth and his preface to the Lyrical Ballads. We study Samuel Taylor Coleridge with specific reference to fancy and imagination. Within imagination, we look at primary and secondary. imagination. In the final block, we study Victorian criticism, we study Arnold, function of criticism. We have an essay, a unit devoted to Karl Marx and Engels. Finally, your SLM ends with a study of Oscar Wilde. A little while ago, we were talking about literary criticism and what it means. You have some important points listed on the screen. This will help you to better understand what literary criticism is. The last bullet point gives an understanding of literary theory. This is further discussed as we move to the next slide. Here you have a very brief definition of what a literary theory is. From here, we move to a slide where we try to compare literary criticism and theory and see how one is different from the other and what is the similarity. These points could also help you to elaborate any question on literary theory and criticism. Then we looked at some very few approaches to literary criticism. We have not listed all of them. Historical biographical criticism, moral philosophical criticism, sociological criticism, Marxist, psychoanalytic, practical, neo-criticism. Then we have feminist criticism. We have queer theory now emerging as an area, eco-criticism, several approaches to criticism and theory. We traced the origins of literary criticism. We looked at a brief division of the major periods. We continued our discussion on the medieval period and its major divisions. For your specific study, it is Plato, Aristotle, and Sir Thomas Aquinas who are prescribed. We do not look at the other developments, at the other contributors. We focused on Plato. We talked about his Republic. We talked about the theory of mimesis, the concept of mimesis. We talked about the theory of forms that Plato lays down. We also discussed Plato's ideas on poets and poetry, and we said how Plato banished poets from his Republic. Republic is his ideal state. Further discussion on his work Republic, how it is written in the form of a dialogue between Socrates and his different pupils. The main questions that are addressed by Socrates in the Republic are given on your screens. We discussed at length about what mimesis is. We talked about idea. We talked about the physical world. We talked about poetry as being twice removed from reality. We had the example of the chair to understand mimesis. We also discussed the theory of forms as laid down by Plato. This is important. We also looked at Plato's ideas on poets and poetry. These points are important because when we come to Sir Philip Sidney, we will be looking at this once again. We talked about Aristotle's Poetics, the elements of tragedy. When we come to Shakespearean drama, we will see how Shakespeare differed from Aristotelian tragedy. Some important terms used by Aristotle are discussed here. Catharsis is the purgation or the purification of the emotions of pity and fear. He lays insistence on the three unities of time, place, and action. Hamartia is the tragic flaw that one finds in the tragic hero that leads to the downfall. Aristotelian tragedy is constructed in a pyramidal format that we looked at in the class earlier. We had a quick study of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. we try to understand the main arguments, and we also looked at the life and contribution of Thomas Aquinas. In the class earlier, we stopped with a discussion on Sir Philip Sidney. We talked about the apology for poetry or a defense of poetry. We told how this is um, uh, in retaliation. When we were looking at the background to the essay, we told about how Gossan had published an essay on, just a second. How Gossan had published an essay dedicating it to Philip Sidney and how he had disparaged poetry. He seemed to be in favor of Plato. It is a very puritanical view that Gossan presents. Sidney counters this by talking about poetry that can be, I think I've listed it in the next slide. Yes. In this, he talks about three kinds of poetry. He talks about divine poetry, as that can be found in the Bible. Being a Christian poet, for him, poetry, the ultimate kind of poetry, is one that is found in the Bible. This is divine poetry of a very high level. Then we have another kind of poetry which is philosophical and moral. This is the kind of poetry that was written by the ancient poets. Then we come to contemporary poets, where it is purposeful poetry. It is poetry that imitates, delights, and teaches. So he uses the same concept of imitation, but he tries to show how imitation is not merely copying something. He says that through imitation of nature around him, through imitation of the reality, the poet's intention is to delight the reader and also to teach the reader. So for him, poetry is not bad, the poets are not bad. In fact, he comes out strongly in defense of poetry. Okay, we have to look at Dryden first. The essay prescribed for your study is, excuse me, there is a slight error here, is an essay on dramatic poesy. In your earlier classes, you have already become familiar with John Dryden. When we were doing the history of English language and literature, you studied John Dryden. You studied John Dryden in poetry. When we were looking at English drama, we also looked at Dryden's contribution to drama. We talked about his contribution to satire, his contribution to heroic couplet. So Dryden is a writer that you're very familiar with. Dryden lived between 1631 to 1700, and he occupies a very important place in the tradition of English critical history. In fact, Dr. Samuel Johnson referred to Dryden as the father of English criticism. Chaucer is referred to as the father of English poetry. Bacon, that is Francis Bacon, is referred to as the father of English prose. And Dryden is referred to as the father of English criticism, and by none other than Dr. Samuel Johnson himself. According to Dr. Samuel Johnson, modern English prose begins with the Essay of Dramatic Poesy, which was published in the year 1668. Give me a minute, please. In the earlier semesters, you learned about Dryden as a poet, a dramatist, an essayist, and as a translator. His output is extremely great. Excuse me. His political allegiance shifted. Initially, he was on the side of King Charles I, but then when Cromwell took over power, he expressed his allegiance to Cromwell, and later, when Charles I's son, Charles II, ascended the throne, he went back showing allegiance to the new king. So we find a shift in his allegiance from one period to the other. You have also looked at how he was famous for several works, Macflecknoe, Absalom and Achitophel. For our purposes now, we'll be concentrating on an essay of dramatic poesy. To note a slight background about this, or the writing of this essay, this was during the outbreak of the plague. Because of the plague, the London theatres were closed down. Remember the COVID period in India and the world, when almost everything was closed down during the lockdown period? Similarly, during the outbreak of the plague, the theatres were closed down. Around such a time, four friends, these are imaginary friends, but each one has a reference to somebody from Dryden's contemporaries. These four friends are Eugenius, Crete, Lycidius, and Neander. Let me show the relevant page from your SLM. In the introduction to this essay, you have all the four friends listed here, and what each one do is also reflected here. Did you see the change in the screen? It is now the page from your SLM. Do you see that?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
I've highlighted it just now. Eugenius represents Charles Sackville, to whom this essay is dedicated. Crete represents Sir Robert Harwood, and he speaks in defense of the ancient writers. Lycidius represents Sir Charles Sedley, and he speaks in defense of the French writers. Neander, that is John Dryden himself, speaks in defense of the English writers like Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, and Fletcher. Now let me take you back to the PowerPoint. Did the screen change?
Yes, ma'am.
Fine. Okay, so we will continue our discussion of an essay of dramatic poesy. As I told you, we find a discussion among four friends, Eugenius, Crete, Lycidius, and Neander. What do these four friends do? They discuss the merits of drama, English writing, and they compare this with the ancients and with the French. The background is a naval war is taking place. In the background, there is the sound of the cannons. These four friends are travel on a barge down the river Thames, and then they want to witness the battle. As they're witnessing the battle, they also start a very literary discussion. So they now start a discussion about the quality of the English writings. Crete is the one who starts the conversation. His argument is that ancient Roman and Greek playwrights are better than modern authors or modern writers. He says that the ancient Greek and Roman writers, playwrights, were excellent at developing a very good plot, and by adhering to the classical unities of time, place, and action, they hold the higher place. They focused their plays on a single plot. There was no concept of a subplot, and the setting was very, very simple. The setting did not change from one country to another, from one region to another region. So we find Crete praising classical writers or the ancient writers like Aeschylus, Sophocles, Seneca, and he considers them to be one of the finest playwrights, and the style in which these writers wrote is often imitated by the other writers who came after them. Now it is the turn of Eugenius. What does Eugenius do? The first one, Crete, praised the ancients. Eugenius comes in defense of the modern writers, and he argues that the contemporary or the modern playwrights have a better knowledge of science, of society, and their understanding of the world and of human nature is much better than the ancients, and therefore he thinks that the modern writers are much better equipped to discuss human emotions or how the universe works. He, unlike Crete, criticizes the classical writers, and he says that the classical writers focus too much on the same kind of subject or the same kind of theme. He also finds fault with them for having characters that are unrealistic or characters that are very shallow. He says that because of the kind of writings of the ancients, whether it is a comedy or a tragedy, it often becomes very repetitive, very predictable, and sometimes it can get very boring. So we have heard the ideas of the ancients as represented by Crete. We have also heard the ideas of the modern writers as represented by Eugenius. Crete, now, because this is a discussion, now Crete comes up and he says he does agree with some points that Eugenius presents, but then he still feels, he argues that each era, each period has its own way of understanding the society and the world around. And for the ancient writers, the way they presented their characters reflected the reality that was true to their period. So the ancients were still good. They were reproducing reality as it was during their time. Now, before Eugenius and Crete can continue their argument about the ancient versus the modern writers, Lycidius shifts the attention from the ancients to the modern and begins to talk about the English theatre and how it can be compared to theatre in the European world. About himself, he said that he prefers the French theatre or French drama or French playwrights to the English theatre, to the English drama, because the French do not mix tragedy and comedy. In general, French writers up to that point of time retained a tragedy as a tragedy and a comedy as a comedy. By and large, they were following the classical rules as laid down by Aristotle. If we look at Shakespearean tragedy or Shakespearean comedy, we notice that we also have tragicomedies written by Shakespeare. So the play is not in a watertight compartment of a tragedy and a comedy in the English theatre. He gives the example of a French classical writer like Pierre Corneille, and he says how we can depend on or we can learn from Corneille to how to set a stage or how to present a play. For the French writers, the main focus is the plot. Their entire focus, in fact, remains on the main plot. They do not use the subplot. They do not include any story besides the main story that they are talking about. This is in adherence to the rules laid down by Aristotle. They also follow the dramatic unities of time, place, and action. Again, something laid down by Aristotle. There is the concept of poetic justice. Good is rewarded, evil is punished in the end. And virtuous heroes are rewarded and the evil characters are punished, or the antagonist is punished. So far, we looked at the essay of dramatic poesy, where we have 4 characters talking, but we have not yet been introduced to Neander. We first saw the battle between the ancients and the moderns. Eugenius representing the ancients, Crete representing the ancients, Eugenius representing the moderns. Then we looked at Lycidius, who is very supportive of French writers. After that, we come to Neander. Neander represents Dryden himself, and we find Dryden speaking in favor of English drama, English writings. Neander says that this combination of tragedy and comedy that one finds in English drama is one of his most favorite aspects of this genre of English drama. He says that a tragic comedy can best portray the way life is. Life is not completely tragedy. It is not completely comedy. It is a mix of both. So this unpredictable mix of joy and sorrow can be represented best through the tragicomedy that we find in English drama. So he thinks that English drama is more realistic when compared to the French drama. He also supports the use of subplots in English drama by saying that the subplots add to the main plot. They do not distract us from the main plot. If you remember the play King Lear from earlier semester, you will know the use of the subplot there. The use of the subplot, the Earl of Gloucester, his legitimate and his illegitimate son, did not detract us in any way from the main plot of King Lear and his 3 daughters, Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia. Talking further, we have Dryden being very supportive of Elizabethan authors. He talks about how witty the plays of Shakespeare are. He talks about how Ben Jonson uses satire, how these writers, whether it was Shakespeare or Ben Jonson, they did not actually adhere to the dramatic unities of time, place, and action, because their main goal was to remain original. They were not merely imitating any or everything. Neander also comes up with the defense of the use of rhymed verse in drama. Up to that time, whether it was Dryden writing plays or whether it was Shakespeare writing plays, there was use of rhyme in drama. He says that it is the use of rhyme which can make drama very powerful and very meaningful, and it helps to hold the attention of the audience. Crete, on the other hand, says that no, rhyme detracts the attention of the audience from the plot. He instead prefers blank verse because that is the natural English sound system, and because people in real life do not use any rhyme. But then, before the discussion can proceed further, before we come to a proper conclusion, who is right, the ancients or the moderns, the French or the English, the essay ends. John Dryden leaves it to the readers to take their own stand, but very wisely, through this conversation among 4 friends, he has tried his best to place before us as many ideas of drama as possible or writings as possible before us. There is not much time for this particular session. It may end shortly. What I will do here is that I will stop here. I'll stop this screen presentation. I will even stop the recording, and we can take some questions.